I always think it's better for someone to have some working knowledge of something rather than to have to educate from the start. And I imagine internal to FDA for the cosmetic staff, just having a commissioner who understands that framework and has thought about MoCRA and, understands what it is could be useful too.
Hello, welcome to episode 28 of FDA Watch. I'm your host, Wayne Pines. As you know, we're the only independent, nonpartisan national forum dedicated to discussing the latest FDA issues. And you don't have to read very far into the newspapers over the last few weeks to know that there has been lots going on. I just want to start out by reminding you that if you have not subscribed to the podcast, you can do so at fdawatch.net. That's fdawatch.net. You'll be the first to get an email whenever a new episode is released, including bonus episodes when there's breaking news. We just posted a bonus episode with Paul Kim and Stuart Pape talking about the resignation of Dr. McCarry. I'm going to ask our two guests today about that and the implications for cosmetics regulation. But please do subscribe, fdawatch.net. Today, we're going to be talking about cosmetics. We have two great guests. I'll introduce them in a minute. Let's get to first some headlines. The biggest headlines, of course, have been what's going on at the top side of FDA with Dr. McCarry resigning, with Kyle Diamantes, the head of the Human Foods Program, taking over as acting commissioner. One area that affects everybody in regulated business is AI. FDA has announced a major expansion of its internal AI capabilities, the rollout of what they call ELSA 4.0, which is an upgraded AI tool that's available agency-wide for everybody, for reviewers, for investigators, and other staff. The agency said it's consolidated more than 40 separate application and submission systems into a unified platform called HALO, H-A-L-O, and that's aimed at integrating still more data. Clearly, the FDA is going toward AI. You can't talk about regulation without talking about AI, and we'll talk about it today as it affects cosmetics regulation. At the recent Food and Drug Law Institute annual meeting, there was a lot of discussion of AI. You'd expect that. And we're going to stay on top of how AI is affecting and changing the way that the agency does business. From the pharmaceutical desk, FDA is seeking public input into new efforts to expand what they call drug repurposing. That means the use of existing products for additional indications, for additional uses. Historically, there have been a number of drugs that have been repurposed. They serve a lot of useful purposes. They've treated a lot of diseases. The agency said that repurposing could shorten development timelines, lower costs, because many products already have established safety profiles. And FDA officials are asking researchers and industry, healthcare providers, patients, and other stakeholders to weigh in on the barriers that limit broader use of repurposed therapies. You can find the FDA's press release on that on its website, fda.gov. From the devices desk, on the devices side, FDA has added neurosurgical patties to its medical device shortage list and warned that ongoing supply disruptions affecting certain neurosurgical products could impact patient care. The agency said the shortages stem from recent supplier and manufacturing issues. These are the kinds of issues that continue to affect all industries. Supply chain is increasingly important in understanding by all industries that are regulated by FDA. From the foods desk, FDA launched its Know Your Nutrition campaign. They did that during National Women's Health Week, which is May 10th through 16th. The initiative is led by the FDA's Office of Women's Health in collaboration with the Human Foods Program. And it's designed to provide women with nutritional resources and education on topics such as how to read food labels, how to reduce sodium, what to do about added sugars, the FDA's updated healthy claim. The campaign also included webinars, blog posts, and online resources. And from the cosmetics desk, PCPC joined a coalition of 20 other trade associations, including several food organizations, that have jointly filed a complaint challenging California's SB 343, which limits the use of certain recycling claims and symbols on product packaging. These groups argue that the law discourages companies from providing recycling guidance to consumers and creates added compliance burdens as businesses revise or remove labeling to reduce potential legal risk. The compliance deadline for this law is October 4th. We're going to keep an eye on that and see where it's headed. Our guest today, first is Jessica O'Connell. She's a partner at Covington, where she co-chairs the Food, Drug, and Device Practices Group. Her practice focuses on food and beverages, dietary supplements, cosmetics, OTC drugs. Today, we're going to be talking about cosmetics. Also joining us today is Rebecca Dandeker. She's a partner at Wiley Rein. Her practice spans prescription pharmaceuticals, OTC drugs, cosmetics, dietary supplements, other consumer products. As it is with Jessica, we're looking forward to get Rebecca's thoughts today on cosmetic issues. So welcome to you both to FDA Watch, and we look forward to hearing from you. I want to start out by talking about what's been going on for several days now, weeks, and that is the resignation of Dr. MoCRA, the elevation of Kyle Del Montes to be the acting commissioner. Let me start out with you, Jessica. What impact do you think that might have on cosmetics regulation?
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think former Commissioner MoCRA didn't seem to have a lot of interest in cosmetics other than perhaps talc. There was a roundtable and other discussion of talc, but that was looking at more broadly at the use of talc, not just the use in cosmetics. So I think I'll push that to the side. We haven't seen a lot from FDA in the cosmetic space. And, I don't know if that was directly, kind of any result of Commissioner McCary's priorities or the administration's priorities more broadly. But I do think, the elevation of Kyle Diamantis to acting commissioner could have an impact just depending on what his areas of focus have been. I mean, at FDA, he's focused on the human foods program. And so there's not really a direct overlap there. But I do know kind of prior to joining the agency, Kyle kind of, was involved in various cosmetic issues. I recall, speaking right after him at a PCPC legal event a year before he was appointed. And so it was a space that he's familiar with and probably continues to be familiar with, I think, in his prior life. And so, there could perhaps be more of an interest in the cosmetic area than McCary had. But that said, I mean, I think a lot of it will just depend on whether any of these cosmetic related activities are a broader priority of this administration.
When he spoke after you at that meeting, what did he say about cosmetics and about MoCRA?
The focus, if I'm remembering correctly, I think the focus of his presentation that year was claim substantiation, kind of marketing claims and advertising. And so it wasn't really directly related to MoCRA as much as cosmetics generally. But it was the PCPC, legal forum. So I can't say that there's anything, specific to MoCRA that I'm aware that he's said in the past.
But certainly because he was a lawyer representing manufacturers and was familiar with the area, he probably knows more about cosmetics regulation than any incoming commissioner or acting commissioner for a while. It's not an area that the commissioners tend to specialize in. I don't know whether that's good. I don't know whether that's good news or bad news. That my guess is that it's good news to have a knowledgeable commissioner. But what do you think about that?
I mean, I think it's always good news to have a commissioner who knows enough to understand kind of issues in a particular area. I think there are some key activities FDA has to complete in terms of implementing MoCRA. And so, again, whether that's something that he on his own, if he had inclination, could push forward, or whether it's just really a broader administration consideration. I think we'll see in how it plays out, and really what comes of it. But I always think, if I'm thinking as kind of representing a client having to engage with FDA, for example, I always think it's better for someone to have some working knowledge of something, rather than to have to educate from the start. And I imagine internal to FDA, for the cosmetic staff, just having a commissioner who understands that framework and has thought about MoCRA and, understands what it is could be useful too.
Right. Rebecca's same questions, basically.
Yeah. Hi, Wayne, and thanks for having me on the podcast today. The changes at the top of FDA, and there have been many in the recent past, what it brings to my mind is how important it is to get policies into the statute, like was done under MoCRA. So these were policy issues that FDA had talked about for quite some time. They were able to get Congress behind it and get MoCRA passed. And now that these issues are in the statute, we don't, as industry, doesn't have to have as much of a worry about who might be the commissioner and how many of the top leaders at FDA would be changing, because we have seen that leadership changes beget policy changes. But we can feel confident that a lot of the MoCRA policies are enshrined in statute, and that's a good thing for industry, and they can feel some level of confidence about the policies sticking around.
Right. That's an interesting point to make, because, as you know, in a lot of the other areas, some of the pronouncements and some of the policies and some of the changes that are occurring have not been enshrined in regulation, or not even in guidances, and certainly not in the law. So the point you make about some level of confidence that the cosmetics industry has with statute is a very interesting perspective. I hadn't heard that before. I'm glad that you made that point. I think it's an important one. Let me continue with that point, and that is, let's talk about MoCRA. It's obviously the biggest overhaul of cosmetics regulation in decades, affects the entire industry. It's just a general question that I've gotten. I'll start out, continue with you, Rebecca. What's going on? What are the questions that the cosmetics industry is facing right now? What are the issues, and where do you see that headed, the implementation of MoCRA?
Yeah, I think, it's been a somewhat of a slow rollout since 2022, but FDA is making some progress. So we're happy to see a couple of guidance documents that came out in late 2025 and early 2026 related to records access authority during inspections, related to their records authority, and mandatory recalls. So that's always helpful to give some color and some policy information to the industry in the form of guidance documents. But there are some big topics that are still unaddressed at the moment. MoCRA gave FDA authority to review the safety data that is substantiating all of the cosmetic ingredients and formulations that are currently in the U.S. market. But FDA hasn't said anything yet about what kind of safety data is going to satisfy them versus what types of data would not be sufficient. So, questions like, is ingredient testing alone going to be sufficient, or does FDA want finished product testing every single time? Can we rely on public literature, or is FDA going to be looking for independent third-party data? Until we get real answers from FDA on these standards, I think the best thing that industry can do in the U.S. is rely on some of the standards that are a little bit more that have been in place for longer, such as those in the European Union and other international standards. Relying on those is a good option while we have this sort of void of details from the U.S. FDA.
Are you advising your clients in the cosmetics area to push FDA on these issues?
I am not. No, I think most of my clients are satisfied with keeping a very close eye on, every statement coming out of FDA, whether it's a published statement, a policy statement, something that, like a Commissioner MoCRA would say from a podium or to a news organization. Any little tidbits coming out of FDA right now, they're watching closely so that they'll be ready to pivot as soon as FDA makes some kind of statement showing, which way they will be going.
Jessica, I've got the same question for you. What are the big issues, and what are you advising your clients to do in order to have FDA clarify the policies in some of these areas?
Yeah. So, I mean, kind of taking a step back on an issue, one thing I've been thinking about a lot is just the timing of how MoCRA implementation is happening right after the reorg that put the cosmetics program into the Office of Chief Scientist, right? And so because of that, I think just the way that cosmetics staff might be approaching trying to implement MoCRA and even the resources that they have available is likely different than when CIFSAN existed and the cosmetics program was part of that, because then they got the benefit of like regulatory counsel that also serve the foods program and policy folks and other folks there that they don't have the same access to now. So the other thing kind of interestingly with that is the way that the inspectorate has been divided up. And the fact that right now there is no kind of dedicated cosmetics inspectorate at all. We have folks who are dedicated on the food side. We have folks who are dedicated on the medical product side. But if you look at kind of the chart, there's no mention of cosmetics. And so one question we've been getting a lot from clients is what we're expecting on GMP requirements. And if we think they're going to become anytime soon at all, how companies can be preparing for that or anticipating what those might look like. And when if and when FDA might start inspecting cosmetic facilities, more regularly than they are now, which isn't done regularly at all. It's really only done for cause. So I think, those are really interesting questions. We saw in the last unified agenda, which was some time ago, and, we've been waiting for an updated unified agenda for a bit, but that FDA moved the GMP rulemaking to the long-term actions. And so it clearly isn't a priority of this administration, which kind of makes sense to me because that's clearly not a deregulatory action. I don't think there's any way you could frame it as one. And so it's a regulatory action. But because of that, I do think there are some companies who might be bringing new facilities online or might be choosing contract manufacturing partners that are just trying to think through, like, what is that going to look like and how can they be anticipating what will happen on the GMP side?
How does a company do planning in what I'll call an uncertain regulatory environment where a lot of the policies just haven't been clarified by FDA? But we know at some point in time, presumably, some of these issues are going to be addressed, GMPs and safety considerations. So how does a company plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think, one theme that kind of came about a lot during the time that MoCRA was being negotiated was really that for many companies, it should have been putting requirements in place that almost those companies were already complying with. There was that thread, a lot of discussion of this isn't, the good kind of the good actors are already complying with GMPs. They're already, voluntarily reporting adverse events, things like that. And so I do think for a lot of those companies, some of it is just continuing to do what they've already been doing, looking to global standards, looking to FDA pass guidance, and just trying to think about the nuances of where things might change. I do think for kind of smaller companies in the space, companies that are just kind of wanting to bring a product to market, that's where there are some more challenges and just thinking about how to establish a compliance framework and what to look to. But in the cosmetic space, there are a lot of global resources. There's, for manufacturing, there's an ISO standard, things like that. And so I think it's just thinking about if there's other resources to look to try to help and anticipating where, what resources FDA might look to as they're moving things forward. I mean, on the bigger picture, I agree. Like, I don't think there's any imminent need to try to push FDA to do anything right now. I don't think I haven't heard from clients kind of, oh, I'm anxiously waiting for, a rule or a guidance, and I feel like I can't move forward without that. And so, I think these things will come about. And I think the longer they take, FDA will start getting pressure from other places, other stakeholders, to kind of try to move those forward. So, I think more industry, my advice is to continue to be prepared for if and when FDA does issue a proposed rule. Are you ready to potentially comment on it? How might you want to engage at that time? Is there any information that could be kind of proactively shared with FDA now to help kind of steer some of these activities? And so really kind of thinking about it from that perspective instead.
Yeah. Do you presume that if and when FDA gets around to issuing guidance or regulations, that there will be sufficient time for implementation so that companies are not going to have to turn on a dime?
I mean, I think for certain of the requirements there would have to be, right? So to me, the ones that I think are necessarily going to take companies time to come into full compliance would be GMPs, and then also the fragrance allergen labeling, because that will be a new thing that will go onto the label that some companies globally identify those, but we don't know if the FDA requirement will mirror the global requirement or not. So for those, I do think there will have to be a good bit of time allowed. And then, I think we've seen in other areas, like I worked at FDA when FSMA was being implemented, for example, and I think there, and I think in other spaces too, FDA takes sometimes the method of, in that first year of compliance, really trying to educate and regulate at the same time. So a bit more of a cushion for companies to kind of make sure that they're doing what the agency expects. And of course, that cushion gets smaller and smaller as years go on, but I would hope there'd be some of that too.
Yeah, Rebecca, I want to ask you about recalls. In December, FDA issued draft guidance on recall authority. Obviously, the FDA now has more authority. How significant is that draft guidance? How significant is the shift from both a legal and a practical standpoint for FDA to have that authority? Are companies ready to abide by, let me ask a different way. Are companies fully prepared for a world in which FDA can compel recalls under certain circumstances?
Right. And I like that you brought up the point about both a legal and a practical way of looking at this. I think legally it is significant, and FDA has been seeking this legal authority for cosmetic recalls for many years. But it was to address a small minority of sellers who had refused to conduct voluntary recalls in the past. So as a practical matter, it's not a significant change for the majority of cosmetic companies who have always conducted recalls as a voluntary action, either when they were requested by FDA or based on their own scientific findings that they felt a product needed to be pulled out of consumers' hands. So I think the disagreement between FDA and industry, which was handled by MoCRA with respect to recalls, is whether a seemingly small manufacturing deficiency, for example, could trigger a perceived safety risk on FDA's part and then a resulting recall request. So it's really positive that FDA issued the guidance in December 2025, which confirmed the limits that it has on its mandatory recall authority. That guidance was called Questions and Answers Regarding Mandatory Cosmetics Recalls. And it explained that mandatory recalls can only be pursued when FDA has a reasonable probability that the cosmetic will cause serious adverse health consequences or death. So it mirrored the MoCRA standard and gives industry some comfort that FDA cannot pursue a mandatory recall for a minor manufacturing infraction.
Jessica, you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I think having mandatory recall authority is a really good tool for FDA to have. I think it's an important thing. I've always been surprised that doesn't exist in the drug space. And there's kind of the proxy of like the the ACRA request recall or whatever, kind of how that's evolved, but it's not the same. I think a class 1 cosmetic recall is rare in the first instance, right? It's probably, I haven't looked at the numbers, but I cannot imagine there's more than a handful of those every year, if that. And so I think there's pretty limited subset of issues that could even trigger this potential authority, in the cosmetic space. But I think it's a good tool for FDA to have in its tool belt. And I think it's important for companies to understand that when they're engaging with FDA and market actions, that is something that FDA has at its disposal. I mean, on the food side, I think FDA's used it 3 times or so, where it's kind of really proceeded, most recently with the raw milk issues. And so, it just really helps ensure that if a company isn't agreeing, that FDA can take that action. But I think on the cosmetic industry, I think it's going to have perhaps even less of an impact, just given that it's hard for a cosmetic to kind of rise to that level of risk.
One more question before we take a break, and that has to do with PFAS. One of the most controversial issues in cosmetics regulations. FDA has reported that there are major data gaps in identifying the products that contain intentionally added PFAS ingredients. How should brands be thinking about risk management when federal policy is still evolving, but the states are moving ahead more aggressively with their own restrictions? We see that in a lot of areas involving FDA regulation. How should brands be thinking about that?
I mean, I think that's the $1 million question. If you could figure out an efficient way for companies to navigate all of these state laws emerging, you should go. That would be a very valuable tool. I think the best advice for companies right now is really figuring out an efficient way to monitor what's happening at the state level, because I don't think that is going to slow down. So whether it's relying on trade associations, which I know in certain product categories, including in the cosmetic space, trade associations are, really trying to help monitor and engage on state legislation. But I think particularly for some of the PFAS requirements, those really cross categories in an interesting way, because it's not like a cosmetic law, it's a law about a component that could be in a range of things. And so I think every company should also be trying to figure out the most efficient way to monitor on their own and make sure that they're able to evaluate it for those requirements for every product that they sell. So just having that system in place, figuring out if companies do need to kind of engage with consultants or outside counsel or otherwise to help with that, and who else they can lean on is really important. I just don't see a scenario where maybe they will slow down, but I think for at least the near term, companies are going to have to comply with these requirements, and it's going to be it's a significant burden and kind of challenge to do so.
Rebecca, the last word on this topic.
Right. Yeah. It brings to my mind that phrase, knowledge is power. So, staying up to date with all your supply chain folks, conducting audits, getting certifications, just knowing exactly what is in your product, who's putting it there, what they use at their level, and going back further in the supply chain than just your direct supplier, who is supplying that person. So, gathering a lot more information than they ever did before, I think is one useful way to be able to make decisions when the state lists, for example, of, supposedly harmful chemicals or ingredients, when they're changing from year to year. When you've got that knowledge base about what exactly is in your product and your packaging and your labeling and your machinery and your facility, all those things, having a really good handle on the details will help you be able to navigate the changing lists of ingredients. And then, always remember, responsible persons who sell cosmetics have to be careful about marketing claims they make on labels and advertising. So if you don't have rock solid evidence that your product is PFAS free, please don't make a statement about your ingredients, because that will invite a lawsuit for false and misleading promotion or unfair trade practices.
So on that note, on unfair trade practices, we'll take a quick break. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. This is where we normally take a short break. Today, we're going to fill this mid-roll break with an exciting announcement. FDA Watch is collaborating with the law firm White & Case and the Berkeley Research Group on a signature series that will focus on an extremely important issue that affects many of our subscribers, namely drug pricing. This is going to be a 4-part series which is going to explore government policies, the role of FDA, pricing strategies, enforcement risk, corporate transactions, and much more. All these episodes are going to be published in June. So I remind you, if you want to get a notice when they are published, when they're available, you just subscribe to FDA Watch at fdawatch.net. One more thing. We're going to have an innovation in our podcast. We've been doing this podcast for almost a year and a half now, and we've had an outstanding reception by across the board in all areas: foods, drugs, devices, cosmetics. And now we're going to have a little bit of a different twist. We want your feedback, our subscribers' feedback on drug pricing issues. So there's going to be a 1-question poll from us on LinkedIn leading up to each of these 4 episodes. It takes a few seconds to respond. We encourage you to comment on that post to suggest a question that our experts will try to answer in each of the episodes. And we're so grateful for the incredible engagement of our followers on LinkedIn. We just wanted to provide another avenue to involve our listeners. So please watch out for those polls from us. Make your questions. Don't forget to subscribe if you don't already subscribe, fdawatch.net, and hopefully your question will be asked on the podcast that we will have in June. And we're back. We're chatting with Jessica O'Connell of Covington, Rebecca Dandeker of Wiley Rein. Rebecca, we're going to start with you. Another area that has been the subject of scrutiny is talc and asbestos testing, particularly after FDA delayed or withdrew certain anticipated rulemaking actions tied to MoCRA. What does that situation say about the challenge that FDA faces in balancing science, enforcement, industry feasibility, consumer expectations? Talk a little bit about talc and asbestos testing.
Yeah, I think you had a great listing of competing factors there. And you didn't even mention political wins or fluctuating priorities at the FDA commissioner level.
We don't have those. I would never mention something like that. Sorry.
Right.
Sorry. Go ahead.
So you can see why FDA takes things slowly sometimes. And I think talc and asbestos testing is one of those places where there are a lot of competing opinions on the topic at a lot of different levels, not the least of which is the consumer who buys the product and the manufacturer who makes and sells the product. Issues between international standards and U.S. standards. So to me, I can understand why FDA may take a step back from time to time in order to hopefully get a really solid, workable policy in place. And hopefully they'll do that soon and reissue that ruling on talc and asbestos testing.
Jessica, anything to add?
I mean, I think that covered a lot of it. I do think with a requirement like that, it's really important to have something in place that makes sense scientifically and is consistent with kind of what the current scientific consensus is. And I do know that there are a lot of kind of other activities around talc testing right now, like USP, I think had a kind of a meeting and was considering putting out additional specifications on testing, for example. And so I can understand why FDA took the action that it did, but I agree. I think that is a MoCRA rule that has the attention of a lot of people. And so I think I would expect that that's one that FDA is prioritizing in terms of reissuing. And I would expect they'll get pressure if they haven't, done so kind of in the relative near term.
New area I want to ask you about, and that has to do with the way that companies are reacting to MoCRA. Do you see companies, even in the absence of a lot of action on the part of FDA, making changes internally in terms of their legal functions, in terms of compliance, in order to prepare for adverse event reporting, product substantiation, documentation? Or are they just sort of waiting back a little bit until FDA takes action in this area? Jessica, what do you think about that? What do you see?
Yeah, I'm seeing most of our clients be as proactive as they can be. And so a lot of that was really looking at kind of internal policies and procedures and making sure that they're aligned with what FDA expectations are going forward. So like on safety substantiation, having a policy for that, assessing the product portfolio and kind of ensuring that the company can say, yes, we can adequately substantiate the safety of our products, and here's how we're doing it, for example. On adverse event reporting, the same. I mean, I do think a lot of companies kind of probably built out a bit more their cosmetovigilance framework just to make sure that they're complying with the requirements there. And so things like that, I think even, going back a year or two, seeing companies really try to look at how they're operating and think about if there are any gaps or policies that they need to improve or implement in order to comply.
Yeah, Rebecca, what are you seeing?
Yeah, I agree. This is the place where companies, at least the ones that I've been working with, are really taking this time while FDA is getting guidance documents developed and standing up the MoCRA programs that they need to conduct. This is the time that companies are scaling up, so to speak, putting additional compliance folks in place, making sure their legal function is ready to handle compliance and detailed regulatory requests. There's just a myriad of regulatory compliance obligations now under MoCRA as well as beyond. Not to mention, as we have earlier, the various state laws and rules that keep popping up. So it makes a lot of sense for companies to put a little more resources onto the compliance function.
Okay, final area, and it's crystal ball time. And I can't go through an interview without talking about AI. Obviously, FDA is heavily into AI, and that will change the world. It already is changing the world. So looking to the future, including the greater use of AI, both by the industry as well as by FDA, where do you see cosmetics regulation heading over the next few years? Rebecca, let me start with you and then give Jessica the last word on that. Look into your crystal ball.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you mentioned ingredient transparency, and that's, one of the things that I think companies have embraced and are continuing to embrace. They're moving toward, quote unquote, cleaner formulations, fewer unnatural chemicals, more labeling information, putting up, a lot of details on their websites that consumers are asking about related to environmental claims, recycling opportunities, where their packaging is coming from, quite a few areas that MoCRA hasn't even touched on yet. So I think transparency is going to be the name of the game for the next few years, trying to get the consumer dollars into their markets.
And how do you see, separate question, AI being used across the board here, both at FDA, in the industry, and even in law firms? We're all going to be using AI.
Right. Well, I guess we have a little bit of a benefit of coming in at the beginning of the AI revolution, right? So we have the opportunity right now, before it's completely ubiquitous, that we can be careful, right? And I do think that companies, law firms, and FDA has shown, at the previous FDLI meeting, there was a lot of FDA commentary about how they're using AI and the ways that they're being careful about, having it go too far, so to speak. So, I think it's important that we all take a step back and make sure that AI is doing the things that we are asking of it and answering, truthfully and carefully. And, that we're all double checking what those answers are for right now until, maybe the next iteration of AI will be more able to answer truthfully without hallucinating.
Jessica, last word.
Yeah, sure. So a couple thoughts. I mean, I think on the FDA side, one area where I've seen AI have an impact already, and this is, I can say cosmetics, but really across spaces, is the use of AI at the border. We know that FDA has employed that to be looking at entries as they come into the country. And I've seen so many more kind of products being held or, detained for what seem to be quite minor issues, like labeling issues or kind of minor issues with paperwork that wouldn't have been caught previously. So just one thing I think for companies to think about, especially companies importing products, and that's a lot in the cosmetic space, is just, I think that's really increased FDA's ability to identify issues at the border. I'm curious to see kind of how that expands to other spaces, but in the last, 6 months, especially, I've seen kind of a big impact there. I think otherwise, one thing that's really interesting to me is the use of AI and kind of developing marketing claims and marketing materials, ranging from kind of developing claims themselves to kind of the images or the people who are appearing in claims, pictures of someone with a cosmetic on them, things like that. And how companies will kind of be able to work to do that in a way where they can still substantiate the claims and using appropriate disclaimers, like all of those things. And so I think in the cosmetic space in particular, that's, we know companies are using AI already to do that. And I think how regulators will look at that is something that I think will be really interesting.
Yeah, it's always interesting to have a cosmetics episode, because we always start out by saying, oh, there's not much happening at FDA, not much happening here. And then we spend a half an hour or more talking about what is happening and the challenges that the industry faces. And we realize that there are still a lot of challenges and still a lot going on in this area and much more to do, especially as AI comes in and becomes more of a factor. So that was a good discussion. I appreciate it from both of you. I want to turn now to our resource link segment. We provide you with some valuable links that you might want to check out. You go to our website, fdawatch.net. In the pharma area, the FDA announced online that it achieved its key first-year goals in the animal testing area. It published online something called the April 2025 Roadmap to Reducing Animal Testing in Preclinical Safety Studies. And if you go to our website, fdawatch.net, you can click on the link to that report. The FDA obviously is very interested in this administration, as in previous ones, in reducing animal testing. That seems to be a consensus on that. In the medical devices area, in a recently released guidance document, FDA final recommendations for patient-matched guides used with orthopedic implants, including devices such as cutting, drilling, and placement guides created from patient imaging data. Very interesting guidance. The guidance outlines FDA's current thinking on device design, manufacturing, software, material control, and validation. So these are customized surgical tools. Very interesting document. Our link takes you to FDA's page where you can download that guidance document. Food link, FDA finalized a new post-market assessment framework for food chemicals and announced fresh reviews of BHT and ADA additives that are used in a wide range of food products. FDA issued a press release on that, and it includes links to relevant documents, and you can get a link to that press release on our webpage. And finally, in the cosmetics area, in an article published by cosmeticsafetyrecord.com, industry observers said many independent beauty brands continue to face challenges adapting to MoCRA, particularly around documentation, safety substantiation, adverse event reporting, manufacturing compliance. We just talked a lot about this, and our link takes you to the article that talks about this. So with that, I want to conclude this episode. I want to thank Jessica and Rebecca for being such insightful guests. I'd like to thank our podcast creator, executive producer, Michael Levin Epstein, our assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind you, if you want to be a guest on our show, want to be a marketing partner or a sponsor, or just comment, you can reach us at info, I-N-F-O, at fdawatch.net. That's info at fdawatch.net. And again, check out our website, fdawatch.net. Finally, I want to mention that if you are so inclined to give us a 5-star rating on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcast, it really does make a difference. So as I say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. See you next time. This is Wayne Pines signing off for FDA Watch.